My fellow knights, I bid you all a good evening. My name is Tyrion. I am one who walks on the path of geekdom and wishes to conquer the mountain that is YouTube. Here, on this warm midsummer eve, I shall dive into the recently finished serial projection cast by the wonderful wizards of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Loki. To give a brief review, I loved this show very much. Out of the 3 MCU shows I have watched, this one is by far my favorite. While the acting in Loki is sublime, the soundtrack and visuals take the cake for me. The orange and bronze tones of the TVA make for a surprisingly fitting cold and autocratic atmosphere while simultaneously maintaining a feeling of warmth and comfort. Not to mention the excellent soundtrack accompanying the scenes. The only issue I have with the show's unconvincing and inadequately supported concept that hiding in an apocalypse would not trigger a branch. If, for argument's sake, Loki had released the only goats that Pompeii had at that particular moment, and they had escaped from the volcanic eruption, their remains will no longer exist to be dug up, thus altering records and potentially changing history as we know it.
But Tyrion, that is such a ridiculous notion. Why would anyone care about ghosts? Such a thing seems so negligible and trifling. How on earth could it possibly change the timeline?
To that I say, if the apple never fell from the tree, onto Sir Isaac Newton's head. Well, we all know that small event would result in a monumental shift in history, would it not? But let us not dally on what I think of the show. It was wonderful, and the prospects of the multiverse that have been spawned are simply marvelous. On to more important matters. I shall once more repeat the statement I made in the Black Widow review. I am not of the comic reading sect. Perhaps there are details in them that may influence and warp interpretation of the themes. But I shall strictly stick to the information given by the show for our discussion. Let us venture into the world politics and poetry to try and uncover the perhaps not so unholy union of Loki and Sylvie. The realms of the internet hasn't exploded into a devastating war zone just yet, but skirmishes and guerrilla warfare among warlords and their respective camps can be witnessed should you know where to look. Most of the combatants fall into 2 camps, those for, and those against the romantic union between Loki and Sylvie, although it must be noted that their ideological ideas and motivations may vary. Those who rally for their union and wish to see the ship sail believe that it is within Loki's nature to fall in love with himself due to his narcissism, with others interpreting their love for each other as symbolic, alluding to the acceptance and love of oneself. Some debate about the nature of the multiverse, and whether or not Loki is completely different to Sylvie, not just through upbringing, or some simply seeing it as no different than any other romantic relationship that may exist, no matter the details or various aspects to said relationship. Those under the banner of the ship sinkers tend to cite the nature of the 2 having a sibling dynamic, thus attributing it with incest. That, or they are simply disheartened and vengeful at the fact that their own ship with Mobius has also been sunk. After mulling over it for the past few fortnights over several chalices of wine, as well as consulting fellow scribes and philosophers, I have arrived at the conclusion that it is, in fact, an acceptable, or perhaps even the finest form of romance one could achieve. There is much to be broken down and dissected before we can draw out and vindicate said conclusion however, so please put down your torches and pitchforks and I shall proceed to do as such. First of all, Mobius called Loki a
seismic narcissist.
The issue here is the lack of fundamental understanding of the nature of narcissism, as well as all the nuances and blurred lines that comes with labels and definitions assigned to a word used as an insult quite casually, and as well as the overlapping attributes with narcissistic personality disorder. Perhaps the best way to explain is by simply looking at the origin of the word narcissist. It comes from the mythology of Narcissus, or Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection in a pool of water and proceeded to either drown, or end his own life due to the fact that he could not be with himself. Loki has his tendencies. Vain? Yes. Arrogant? Sure. Attention-seeking? Most definitely. He wants a throne. He made a play devoted to his sacrifice. And yet, Mobius delivered a very nasty reality check and forced him to confess his true feelings. Very ironically, I might add, considering he is the one that later refers to him as a narcissist.
It's the cruel, elaborate trick conjured by the weak to inspire fear.
A desperate play for control. You do know yourself.
That is nothing like what Narcissus would behave like, now would he? He killed himself looking in a bloody mirror, for crying out loud. He is aware of his behavior, his mistakes, his flaws, and he acknowledges all of it. Falling for Sylvie isn't narcissism, he barely has enough love and respect for himself, much less someone who is an entirely different entity. Which leads to the second topic at hand. The nature of the multiverse, specifically, its denizens. What makes this such a complicated matter is the seemingly baseless nature of what the TVA consider branches, or nexus events. I must be honest. I am still wrapping my head around this myself. But I will speak my thoughts and invite you all to do the same. The TVA seemingly only makes their move if a timeline branches out too far. Meaning they would theoretically allow it to exist should it not impact the sacred timeline in any drastic way. This is supported by classic Loki's story. I suspect that outside of using a lot more magic, the details of everything in his timeline remains relatively similar to our Earth 199,999 Loki, up until when he faked his death. Since he chose to live in solitude in some corner of the universe, presumably there was nothing his presence could influence or alter. He mentioned that only when he got lonely and sought out his brother did the TVA appear to intervene. And yet we have the two variants that quite clearly contradict this rule. Alligator Loki's contradiction is as plain as a pikestaff. One theory is that he lives in a timeline that is radically different from any Loki variant we have seen, one where it is dominated by animals, one not unlike that of which Spider-Ham would hail from. Perhaps Alligator Loki would have been born to crocodilian parents, adopted by frogs, and socialized with cats. Whatever the case, it is very clear that he is not a young gator. He is at the very least a juvenile, several years old at the bare minimum. But that would invalidate the fact that the TVA stops branching timelines from becoming too radical, for the nature of the timeline would be far too radical to exist in the first place. We know Loki can transform himself into a snake. You could argue then, that he was pruned when he was a wee lad, by being a Loki that preferred to present himself as an alligator, and he grew up alongside the other Lokis in the void for years. Which does bring into question Loki's shape-shifting. The introduction of duplication casting and its definition very likely touched upon molecular structure, which could imply that there is much more to his shape-shifting than we initially thought. I shall discuss the topic of whether or not Loki has ever truly shape-shifted in another video. The topic of romance and love is already bewildering as it is. To make it brief, Alligator Loki possessed enough strength to dismember President Loki's arm quite easily. While I'm no anatomy boffin, I'm quite certain it would be considerably much more difficult to do so with human jaws. This could mean that either Alligator Loki is shape-shifted on a genetic and molecular level, or we come around back again to the fact that he is indeed a biological alligator. Sylvie is yet but another drastically different variant. Her Nexus event should have arguably started the moment Odin, or perhaps Frigga, informed her that she was adopted. It would have immediately changed the way she thought of herself, and perhaps even of how Odin and Frigga would treat her. One more important thing to note that had fans in a frenzy was the fact that she was playing with a Valkyrie. While Thor also displayed knowledge of Valkyries in Ragnarok, it would make sense for Sylvie's version of Odin to have told her about Hela and the Valkyries, what with his openness about her adoption to begin with. Sure, it could have been nothing more than an innocuous Easter egg for the sake of it. But it fits like a puzzle piece into the narrative of how radically different Sylvie would have grown up to be. She grew up for gods know how long in apocalypses, one nightmare after another. Constantly surrounded by desperate, violent and barbaric people she cannot trust, living life on the edge, where one mistake would mean her undoing. Whichever and whatever the case, they all point out to the same thing. That no matter what, they are too different for their relationship to be considered incestuous. To conclude this point with a convoluted analogy, two queens from differing chessboards would have the same moveset, But even boards made under the same manufacturer would never have the same fate, even when bought and utilized by the same owner. Moving on from there, we have the final issue. How and why it would be immoral. I'll jump right to it. It simply isn't. It is unconventional, bizarre, absolutely off the walls, call it whatever you want. But immoral? Not even in the slightest. There simply isn't a solid enough reason for it to be so. We have established that they are neither akin to siblings, nor are they genetically similar, thus negating the argument of incest. Of course, should my previous point be wrong and it turns out that Loki and Sylvie have the same genetic makeup, and should they copulate and produce offspring, it would be the most catastrophic case of inbreeding that has ever occurred throughout all history. The worst combination of genes possible would give rise to the most fiendish creatures to have ever existed. It is likely that the resulting creatures would be ghastly. Potential examples would be giant wolves, world serpents, or eight-legged horses that would be given up as child slaves, or work horses rather, to the gods, with the absolute best case scenario resulting in the child born half dead. Although I suppose it is pointless to debate whether or not that Loki and Sylvie having children would be an issue. I doubt they could. What with the number of times Sif need Loki, his family jewels should be diamond dust. Loki's attraction towards Sylvie isn't narcissistic, it isn't even selfish. It is rooted in their mutual and earned respect. They complement and bring out the best in each other. Two Lokis working together. They would be a force to be reckoned with, one so powerful and influential it branched at a rate that was never seen before. Mobius assumed that the reason for their Nexus event was their reality-breaking romance, but I disagree.
But Tyrion, they were caught in the obliteration of a planet. Notwithstanding the theory of hiding in apocalypses you mentioned was flawed earlier, they couldn't possibly have survived that. It wouldn't matter. Surely there could not be any other reason than their romance?
Well, let us not forget the fact that Thor did survive getting blown up by a spaceship, after getting wasted by both Hela and subsequently Thanos.
But Loki isn't an Asgardian? He's a Jotun.
While we could agree that they are of similar stock, yes? They grew up together and more than likely trained together. Laufey withstood a direct surprise hit from Gungnir in the back, and didn't die immediately. Loki himself was up and walking minutes after having an arrow explode in his face and getting ragdolled by Hulk. We can assume that Sylvie has a similar level of durability, if not arguably higher, seeing that she lived in harsher conditions for much longer. As proof, they tamed Goliath, a supreme being that lays waste to all in its path, by combining their powers together. It is more than probable that they could survive the destruction of Lamentis in that manner. In Loki's own words, perhaps they are stronger than they realize, and perhaps the key to unlocking their powers is something neither of them ever had. A strong, healthy relationship filled with support and love. Perhaps the only issue is that it was developed over the course of seemingly several days, little over a week at most. Or maybe much shorter or longer. Time in the TVA seems to work differently. They had little time to prepare a solid foundation, resulting in their short, emotional bout at the series climax. Even so, they had many wonderful moments. Sylvie sleeping on the train shortly after proclaiming that she could not do so in the presence of someone she does not trust. Their lakeside hand-holding. The heartbreak in Loki's eyes when Mobius bluffed about Sylvie's death. Or their little farce in the void where the two frost giants feigned being cold. And perhaps, these little moments are precisely what makes them such a great couple. It is debatable as to whether they are the MCU's best. They're certainly far from the most solid, the most developed, or the most picturesque. But they are, in my eyes, by far, the most gratifying. That monumental feeling of finding someone after being so devastatingly alone, for millennia. Someone who shares your plight. Someone who could truly understand the pain. The very embodiment of acceptance you've been waiting for. Not just someone you want, but someone you need. Alas, 'tis but a theory. At the end of the day, it is but a mere projection, a realm of fantasy. Worrying over the morality and correctness of something whose nature does not align with our own is nothing but utter nonsense, even if it was meant to be a reflection of our universe. Besides, Wanda fell in love with a household appliance. No one really complained about that, now did they? With the debate swiftly ended, I shall announce my return soon. we shall dive into the daring question that is, has Loki ever actually shapeshifted consciously on his own? Once more, my name is Tyrion, and I bid you all a good evening. Stay healthy, stay sharp, and stay away from the plague. Cheers.